Today, of course, we know a lot more about dioxin and what it can do. It's a persistent organic pollutant. It can cause cancers. It can cause reproductive and developmental problems, damage the immune system. It interferes with hormones. Since 1991, the U.S. Institute of Medicine has been tasked by the U.S. government to follow the research and see what exactly dioxin and the herbicides used in Vietnam can do to the human body, and come up with a list of conditions that they believe are related to it. And this is that list. It's over 20 conditions, classes of different diseases as well, that have been found to be associated to exposure. The U.S. Veterans Affairs will compensate victims for 15 of these at this point, including the Parkinson's that my father suffered from for many years. However, when it comes to birth defects, that's a whole other story. While research shows dioxin can cause birth defects in animals, it is much harder to test humans. And you can't purposefully contaminate a human with dioxin and see what it does. It's not ethically allowable. And plus, it's hard to factor out all the other things in a human body that, in a human interaction, that might be causing the birth defects. You can do that in animal studies because you have it isolated, but you can't do that in humans very easily. So you have to do epidemiological studies and look at populations that were exposed and try to figure out, are there higher elevations of birth defects in this exposed population, but not in this? And then you make correlations and figure out if there is an increased elevation. And complicating the matter in looking at birth defects is that many of these conditions are extremely rare. So even if you have a population, you have to have that you're looking at, you'd have to have millions of people in order for some of these birth defects to pop up out of the ordinary. And also, most of the studies that have been done on people who've been exposed has been on males, male chemical workers or male veterans. Very few studies have been done on women, which might potentially have a different impact. Nonetheless, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs does acknowledge that spina bifida, one of the birth defect, is related to a father's service in Vietnam, because they did find, in looking at people who were part of the ranch hand spray program, had higher rates of spina bifida in their population. So that is the only condition that the U.S. government recognizes as related to exposure to herbicides in Vietnam for males. For females, there was only about 8,000 females who served in Vietnam. That's a different story. The Veterans Affairs had looked at females and found elevated birth defects and all types of different birth defects amongst this population, even though it's a small number. And so now they basically, if you're a female veteran who served here, if you have a child with a birth defect, as long as there's no known cause or family history, you could potentially be compensated for that. And many of those conditions that were on that list before are ones that I see every day in my work here in Vietnam and in Laos. By the way, children of male veterans believe that their conditions and their illnesses are related to their father's service. And they have been advocating for attention from the U.S. government, slowly working together. This is Heather Bowser, who was born without a limb and some missing fingers, who has been leading this coalition called the Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Alliance, to try to get, especially now that we can do further studies. Now that we've mapped the genome, we can get right into that epigenetic layer of our bodies and look at what things can do to our genome. That's a whole area of science that wasn't there 10 years, wasn't even there 5 years ago. And so now we're thinking maybe if we go back and look at the data, we can finally answer that question, how dioxin affects the body. And this is something the children of veterans are pushing for. The Vietnamese have done their own epidemiological studies, and they found higher rates of birth defects in areas that were sprayed compared to areas that weren't sprayed, in populations who, veterans from the north who went down to the south to fight have come home and they had higher rates of birth defects in their families. So they have seen this, but the science, most Western scientists that look at the Vietnamese research complain that it hasn't been peer-reviewed, so they don't necessarily give it a lot of emphasis to it. But the Vietnamese believe that up to 3 million of their citizens who were sprayed have health effects, including up to 300,000 children who were born with disabilities. And this has been a point of disagreement between the US and Vietnam ever since the war was happening, when in the south of Vietnam, women were coming into Saigon and giving birth to children who had severe malformations that hadn't been seen before. So the Vietnamese had been suspecting this for a very long time, and the US has said from the start, there's no correlation. And this is where I get a little angry about it, because on the one hand, we're giving disability benefits to our veterans who have cancers and other problems, who are exposed to Agent Orange, and their children if they have spina bifida, or their children if they're female if they have a birth defect. But on the other hand, we're saying there's no correlation. And that hypocrisy just really gets me and gets me moving on this issue. Dioxin has a very long half-life in the soil. In fact, it's up to centuries. If it's underneath the layer of soil and the hot sun isn't hitting it, it could stay there for centuries undisturbed. In the body, the half-life is 7 to 10 years, around that. And the way to get rid of that, basically, if you're a female, is you have a child and you breastfeed, and there goes your dioxin out of your body. But it can stick around for a very, very long time. Thankfully, research done by the Hatfield Consultants Group in Canada found, by comparing the areas that were sprayed to areas that weren't sprayed, they found that, this was done in about the mid to late 1990s, they found that the areas that were sprayed did not longer have high levels of dioxin in the soil, at least by the end of the 90s. And they believe mainly it's because of all the years of monsoon rain did wash a lot of it away, and maybe some of the tropical sun did expose earth, because you have to remember people were turning the earth over and over as they were growing their crops. So thankfully, it's no longer in the soils of most of Vietnam, except for on the air bases where the US stored these chemicals or loaded the airplanes. And there's 3 main ones right now: Bien Hoa, Phu Cat, and Da Nang, that have high levels of dioxin still in the soil. In some cases, hundreds or 1,000 times more than what would be accepted if this was an industrial site. And it turns out this is where there's a little positive part of the story. After the US and the Vietnamese became aware that the vast areas that were sprayed were not contaminated, the US began to think, okay, it's not such a huge problem, maybe we can deal with this. Because we had been pressuring them, organizations like my own, the Vietnamese, had been pressuring the US government for years that you've got to do something about cleaning up the mess you left behind. And they were hesitant to do that until this research came out to say, okay, it's pretty contained to 3 or 4 different places throughout the country. And so the US was finally able to, and the Vietnamese were finally able to begin to work together. This breakthrough actually came in 2006 when President Bush and President Triet met here in Hanoi, and they agreed in their formal joint statement that further joint efforts to address the environmental contamination near former dioxin hotspots, dioxin storage facilities, would make a valuable contribution to the continued development of our bilateral relations. So in addition to that information that was coming out about it's not as big of a problem as they thought, at least in hotspots, the US and Vietnam had been trying to work together, particularly their militaries, partly because of that neighbor just to the north of us. They really wanted to develop better relations with Vietnam on a military-to-military basis, and this kind of became a way for them to do that. Because prior to that statement, the US and Vietnam had been trying to work together, particularly their militaries, they really wanted to develop better relations with Vietnam on a military-to-military basis, and this kind of became a way for them to do that. Because prior to that statement, the US and Vietnam had been trying to work together, particularly their militaries, The Agent Orange issue had been a very contentious one between the US and Vietnam. The Vietnamese had been raising this issue, as I said, since way back during the war, and then again in bilateral relations, in bilateral meetings after the two countries normalized relations. And they were always ignored by the US. The US did not want to deal with that issue. The two sides did try to work together in 2002. After they had that conference in Hanoi, they were going to try to work together and answer this question about birth defects and its relationship to dioxin and Agent Orange. But the two sides got into fights over the protocols of the research. The US wanted to control all of the samples that were taken and test them themselves, and the Vietnamese, surprise, surprise, didn't want to give all that power to the US. They wanted to also control the samples to make sure that there was no funny business going on when the US took the samples away. So anyhow, the research fell apart, and that began some of the very dark age of, as I call it, the dark years of this issue. The embassy, after that effort to try to work together fell apart, the embassy began to really believe that this was, the Vietnamese were only using Agent Orange to either get reparations from the war that they had signed off on when the two sides normalized relations in 1995, and it was just propaganda. It was a way for the Vietnamese to try to shame the Americans into helping. I even had one, you just couldn't even talk to the US Embassy at this time about Agent Orange. In fact, I had one embassy staffer tell me, stop talking about Agent Orange. He said, you should be thinking about all of the good that America did for Vietnam during the war. And I just looked at him like, what? He said, we built highways. We built the airport you just landed on in Da Nang. They should be grateful. I couldn't believe it. And that just made me so angry that it just got me moving even more forward on getting this issue resolved. I think that the Vietnamese would have rather had their 3 million sons and daughters who were killed during that war back and have healthy children than have Highway 1 between Hanoi and Saigon, honestly. So thankfully, the US and Vietnam got to this point where they could start to work together on this issue. Because a cleanup is it's a lot less controversial, and it has a finish. In fact, the Vietnamese and the US plan to finish this process of working on the contamination in the next, say, 5 to 10 years. They began to work together on the Da Nang Air Base, but they had yet to even address any of the health issues at this point. But at least we were getting somewhere at the table talking together to work on this issue for the first time. After 2006, when Bush and President Triet met, this opened the door for my senator, Senator Leahy, to put actually some money to this issue. And he allocated the first amount of money, $3 million, to come to Vietnam to address this problem of remediation of dioxin contamination in Vietnam and to support health programs in the communities surrounding that. And since 2007, my Senator Leahy, I mean, Bernie's great too, I must say. Unfortunately, he's still great. But Senator Leahy has been someone who has been advocating for post-war support for countries all over the world, but particularly in Vietnam. And he took on this issue, and he's been able to get $140 million for the cleanup of the dioxin-contaminated sites in Vietnam, and $30 million for health programs for people with disabilities in Vietnam through Congress, which is kind of unheard of when you have a Republican Congress that is against anything the Democrats want to do in the US. But he was able to get this through, which has been pretty amazing. So since the dark days, we have seen a greater progress between the US and Vietnam on this issue. And this is a photo of our current ambassador, Ted Osius, holding the soil of that contaminated soil that was in Da Nang, that they cleaned in this process of putting it in this it's basically a big oven that heats up the soil to 365 degrees Celsius to the point that the dioxin molecule breaks down. And that soil is now clean enough that the Vietnamese are using it to build, expand one of the runways at Da Nang. And now they're putting more soil in there, and this whole project, $100+ million project, should be finished in about a year and a half. And then the Vietnamese and the US are going to go down to Bien Hoa and figure out what they can do there to clean up. So I'm confident now, after 20 years of working on this issue, that on the environmental impact side, that's taken care of. I don't have to worry about that. But when it comes to the human health impacts, we still have a very, very long way to go. The US still does not acknowledge that there are people impacted by Agent Orange in Vietnam. But however, they are at least not ignoring the population, that the Vietnamese people are ill and disabled from Vietnam. Before, they used to go out of their way to avoid doing anything that might be misconstrued as helping an Agent Orange victim. I lobbied, sorry, I can't lobby as a non-government organization. I advocated in DC with other colleagues to get the US to target this money that they were giving to the project, so that at least it would be targeted in the areas that were heavily sprayed and targeted at the population with severe multiple disabilities that the Vietnamese believe are affected by Agent Orange. And that, thankfully, is finally happening. And because of, and I mean, I'm very lucky about this, because without support from our donors, big and small, I would never have met Hoai Tung, who's this amazing young girl who lives in Cu Chi, who, despite not having arms, she has won penmanship competitions at her school. She writes just, with their two arms together. She does have a prosthetic arm that we gave her, but she hates using it because, you want to change the crayon, you have to unscrew it and take it out. I mean, it's a very minimal, a very basic limb. And we've actually been working with some students to try to get a 3D arm printed for her. That's one of our next projects. And Hoai Tung also is unable to walk because on her legs, because she's missing one leg to about her knee, and the other one is very malformed. But she's learned to walk on prosthetic legs, though she leaves them at home because she finds the scooter she uses at school much more easier to get around. And when one of her classmates said to her, "You don't have any legs," and she said, "Of course I do. I left them at home." She wants to be a doctor, and I know she will succeed. She is smart as a whip, but I feel so blessed that I've been able to meet her. And without the work, without the support of so many people for my work, I would not have been able to witness the love between Nam and his mother and his grandmother. Nam is unable to move and unable to speak, except for with 1 foot he can move 1 foot, and they've developed a language with that 1 foot. If he has a television and he loves to watch Vietnamese TV, and he will use that 1 foot to put blocks to say, I want channel 1, I want channel 2, I want channel 3. I mean, it's amazing just to see the challenges that I mean, really I don't think I personally could overcome. Or I would not be able to meet an amazing father such as Mr. Ah here, who is pictured with 2 of his 3 daughters. When I first went to his house, it's about 5 years ago, and what we do is we go in and we figure out, what is it that we can do? Our project's small, what is your greatest need? And, we have this discussion about, what we can do to help. And he said to me, I need a little red stool. And I mean, if you've been to any of the cafes here, you've seen them. They're like really small plastic red stools. They cost about $1. And I thought, that's all he's asking for. I was really confused. I said, why? And he said, well, I repair bikes, and I'm getting very old, and it's hard for me to squat. But if I had a red stool, I could continue my work, and I could feed my daughters. I mean, it was just incredible that, you know, what made a difference in his life was a $1 stool that he didn't buy himself because that would have taken $1 away from his daughter's meal. We got him that stool plus a bunch of other equipment so that he could expand his service from bicycles to motorbikes. And I get so much more out of my interactions with these amazing people who face such huge obstacles day in, day out than I'm able to provide them with our work. They inspire me each and every day. Witnessing their victories, either small or large, just motivates me to keep moving. What I do is, it's selfish. It's not selfish work, it is selfish because I take much, we've heard this before, I take much more from them than I'm able to give them. And it also gives me faith working with these incredible families that Agent Orange is a story that does have an end as long as we work together, government to government, organization to organization, people to people. And I have to keep going because until I can answer that question that I get every time I go to a house, a mother will ask me, who's going to care for my children when I die? And I don't have that answer yet. So until I can answer that, I'm going to keep moving forward. And so that makes you think, well, what is it that one individual can do? We heard from what Bob Feldman did, but others have contacted me, and we heard this earlier as well. Do what you can, what's in your own power, what's in your skill set. And this young brother of, this is an amazing documentary film that if you're American, you can see on Netflix. It's not yet international Netflix, but it's called Chow Beyond the Lines, about that young man that you might have seen in the earlier slide painting with his mouth. But it was nominated for an Academy Award. And Carson, who's the brother of the director, is from Southern Florida, and he had a film screening at his school, and he made these bracelets that you see all over, people wear. $2, he sold them to his fellow classmates. And in just that one night in that screening, they earned enough money to buy a wheelchair for one of the people we work with in Vietnam. So that is one very concrete, simple thing someone has done. We must keep remembering this and reminding people that these consequences of war must be avoided, or at least if you don't know what they are yet, you've got to address them. You can't ignore them like the US did for 30 years. And we must teach this lesson to all of our youth, everybody. We must, if we ever hope for peace to overcome war, we've got to keep pounding this message that wars have long-term, huge environmental, huge personal impacts. But I also do this work to remind people that two enemies can finally come together and work to address the consequences when they get over that animosity and can get to that point. But also, as you've learned here in Vietnam, particularly if you're American, that citizens of two countries that are even currently at war today, or war at war just years ago, the two citizens are not enemies of each other. Our governments may be fighting, but the citizens can be friends. And we must, I have to have some hope. I don't know if you can end all wars. I mean, I think that's a little pie in the sky, but at least let's hope that we can mitigate the consequences as much as we can. I think I've gone on too long, but thanks.
Hello, my name is Linh and I'm from Vietnam, RMIT University. And my question for this topic is, what do you think will be the next step that the US and other NGO organizations will take to mitigate the pain that Agent Orange is doing to the victims? Because the money compensation and other fund can only sustain their existence. So they only exist, that they are not living to engage with the community. So the bigger question is how to engage them with the community.
the U.S. government to engage them. Unfortunately, I mean, it's sort of part of the aid game. The U.S. Aid to foreign countries is that its money gets channeled to the U.S. U.S. Agency for International Development, and they develop this plan of how they're going to use it. And right now they have this 5-year plan to improve services and to, so that's the physical therapy, occupational speech therapy. They like to, like I said earlier, they like to fund infrastructure or fund capacity development. They do not want to fund the projects that go directly to the individuals, unfortunately, because they believe right now it's logistically too difficult and too expensive. So that $30 million they're giving right now, once you spread it out to 300,000 children, is not going to go very far. So how to get them to move on that? What I do is I try to get them to at least increase the funding every year, which is already difficult enough to do. But also to try, as I said, I try to get the organizations who are receiving this money from the U.S. government to get away from Da Nang and to get away from Saigon or the capital city, you know, the main cities, and get to where the people are. Don't expect them to come to you. And that's a huge, huge challenge. But it also comes down to more awareness. You know, Americans have a pretty good heart for the most time. You wouldn't know it in this election campaign in the U.S., but I think I do have faith that the more people who hear this story, the more people will want to do something to help. And the Vietnamese individual civilians have been doing this for years, so I think it's getting that information out there will help finally get the money to the right people who need it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll take a question off Twitter. Jess M. wants to know, Susan, is there any continuing monitoring of fish or crops to mitigate continuing exposure? If so, who does sampling?
There is, outside the dioxin hotspots that the U.S. and Vietnamese government are working on cleaning up. There is, in fact, just a few months ago, they finished the environmental impact study of the Bien Hoa Air Base, and they did a lot of sampling of the animals that could potentially be exposed, and the fish and the ducks and all of that other. But that's only happening in the areas that have been identified as hotspots. The Vietnamese government and the Ministry of Environment is also doing some testing elsewhere. Again, just to see if this theory that there's no contamination in the sprayed areas is still valid. The problem is, of course, Vietnam is now a very industrialized country. Dioxin comes from industrialization. So there are other problems coming to Vietnam that are unrelated to the Agent Orange issue. But thankfully, because of Agent Orange, people are a little bit more aware of it. And maybe the Vietnamese in the room know what happened in the Central Coast with the fish that were completely devastated by a company that was releasing toxin into the ocean. Hundreds, I think it was 200 kilometers of the coastline, the fish were just washing up on shore. I mean, incredible.
Wow.
And there was a fast reaction to that. And it could have been because there's been so much attention to Agent Orange and its environmental impacts. I'm hope that was one positive of this story.
All right, we'll take a next question in mic 3.
Good afternoon. I want to know, is there any official plan to offer them some jobs they can do, or just encourage them to work in the future, or have some training program to help them to find some jobs? Because it is difficult for their parents to support their own life. They need to know how to make a living. As we can saw the picture before, a girl likes drawing. Maybe she can be a painter in the future. Is there any official plan?
My organization does a little bit of that, but because we're so small, we don't do the training. We connect people to existing programs. But the Vietnamese, there's plenty of vocational training programs in Vietnam. There needs to be more, obviously. And there have been a lot of efforts, particularly to get Vietnamese who have physical disabilities into training programs for like IT or computer, fixing motorbikes or whatever that they can do with their hands, even though their legs are unable to move. So there are programs existing. None that because we're so small, we are not able to do those ourselves. The U.S. government has funded some of those in the past as well, but they've been pretty small. But the Vietnamese have been. They recently passed a law on disabilities here in Vietnam. And I believe Vietnam has signed the International Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. I don't know if it's been ratified yet, but job training and education and providing equal opportunities for people with disabilities is part of that effort. So I have hope that there will be more of that in the future. Comes money though, big problem.
Thank you.
We'll take the next question out of mic 1.
Hi. So I would say it's generally agreed that a major part of solving global and large-scale issues is spreading awareness and informing people on the facts surrounding the issues at hand. But so many Americans, particularly older generations that I've seen, stubbornly hold on to this mindset that the U.S. can do no wrong, and the decisions we make that don't seem to cause domestic harm are indisputably correct. Like, I know even to try and explain the things you've just said to my own parents, at the very least, they'd respond with large skepticism and maybe even say that they're literally lies. So in your experience, what ways have been effective in offering a correcting narrative to people who don't want to hear or believe it?
Oh, that's a tough question. I always believe that being truthful and honest and not exaggerating the situation, and that in itself is powerful enough. And I mean, it's part of the problem that happened between the U.S. and Vietnam is, earlier I said that the U.S. thought it was all propaganda, that the Vietnamese were saying every single child born with a disability in this country is disabled because of Agent Orange. The Vietnamese never said that. That's what the Americans were hearing. And it's really, really, really hard to change when people have a preset notion of something, to change that. But I mean, I can only hope that being honest and also that showing, an individual's human situation, that's a truth right there that you can't deny. And if they are denying it, God help them, really. I wish I had a better answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the next question is by Santiago Montes de Oca. Sorry. Even if it's banned in the U.S., is dioxin still present in herbicides or pesticides produced in other countries?
Well, what is banned is this particular herbicide 2,4,5-T, and at this point it's a worldwide ban. But yes, because dioxin is a byproduct of the chemical process, manufacturing process of herbicides and of chemicals, dioxin, I mean, not necessarily the TCDD, which was the very particular one associated with Agent Orange, may not be in some of these herbicides, but other dioxins are. And there's a lot of research that has been done since, continues to be done, about the dangers of herbicides. And it's a big problem, especially in Southeast Asia. I mean, many places as well. But, for instance, in Laos, where I also work, they had an almost organic farming tradition just because they didn't have money for herbicides. And now they're buying them, massive amounts. There's plantations that are being, of bananas and other crops in the country that the Chinese are developing, and the Vietnamese, and the Thais, their neighbors are using Laos as a garden, basically, and they're bringing these herbicides into the country now. I think you really have to, I mean, I am someone who will not use a chemical if I can avoid it at all, and I think we really have to push that message that there are no safe herbicides.
Thank you. Final question.
Hello, Susan. My name is Frederick from Zambia. You're such an amazing creation from God, Susan. I love what you're doing. And from now on, Susan, I've offered myself to be one of your disciples. And from now, if you are going to visit those families tomorrow, please let me go with you. I offer myself. My question, our global icon, Nelson Mandela, said that the greatest present or gift you can give to someone in education. Once you give them education, you're done. Do you have a deliberate policy, Susan, as to, you know, the habit of donors? Sometimes they have a lifespan. They don't go on and on to give you, to help you. At some point, they may stop to help you. Do you have a deliberate policy to kind of concentrate on educating these families, reduce, for example, 80% of what you're receiving, so that maybe you empower them with an education than any other things? Thank you, Susan.
I didn't quite catch that last part. Sorry, it's hard to see you with this.
Your deliberate policy, for example, to concentrate on educating these families, maybe much of your support that you're getting?
So educating, well, it's a couple things. I mean, educating, one of the, I guess, all this attention to Agent Orange that has happened over the last decade here in Vietnam has, at least in Vietnam, it used to be, and it's in many countries as well, that if you have a child with a disability or an illness or something, it's due to your fate, something bad that happened in your ancestors that got you to this, that caused this to happen. And one of the sort of positive things about the attention to Agent Orange has been that families have learned it wasn't something my ancestor did. There is a cause for this problem. And if there's a cause, people make that next logical conclusion, there's something that can be done about that. And so we do a lot of that type of education to educate parents that, yes, you may have a child with a severe disability or cognitive disability, but there are things that they can learn and things that you can learn to make their lives, their daily life, better and less burdensome. So we do a lot of that type of education. And then general education to people about disabilities in general, but also Agent Orange around the world. And on a practical level, you know, in those families, you know, as I said, when that particular child may have a severe enough physical problem that they're not able to go to school for whatever reason. But we can educate their children, their siblings, so that they can get a job and they can help their parents in the future with the care of that child. So there's a lot of different levels.
All right, I'd like to give you a prophecy, Susan, that even if tomorrow you drop dead, your family will never ever lack bread. Thank you.
Thank you.